This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 7 of my series over Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. Much like Henry McCarty, a.k.a. William Antrim, a.k.a. William H. Bonney, soon to be Billy the Kid, much like the Kid, another youngster was thrown into the Lincoln County War by pure happenstance. Sometime either right before or right after the July 4th chase by Buck Powell and Marion Turner along with their Seven Rivers boys, around the time of the chase which saw the Regulators fleeing back to Chisholm's ranch, a 17-year-old named Tom Folliard, sometimes Tom O'Folliard, but Tom arrived and promptly joined up with the Regulators. Tom Folliard was from Uvalde, Texas, and he headed west like so many other young men before and after him. He was probably looking for work, and when he was told McSween paid his boys $3 a day instead of the regular $1, he was sold American. It was also at this time, when Tom showed up, that McSween had decided that hiding out was no longer possible, and that it was time to return to Lincoln. Consequences be damned. McSween had come to realize that dying in his own home was preferable to hiding out in the Pecos Valley, away from his wife and the town he loved. Even if those who ran the town and the nearby fort and the county and the territory, even if they all wanted him dead. But McSween wasn't just handing himself over. He knew now, as he had before, that course of action was certain death. Best to avoid it for as long as possible. On July 14, 1878, McSween, William Bonney, the Kid, Tom Folliard, also a kid, and all the Regulators still alive, the whole party left the Chisholm Ranch and quickly made their way back to Lincoln. On the road, in Roswell, they picked up another Regulator named Joe Smith. In Picacho, they picked up around 20 New Mexican Hispanics. They avoided San Patricio, but many men from that small town joined them as well. By the time the party reached Lincoln on that very same day, McSween had nearly 60 armed men accompanying him. He came prepared. This preparation, and the amount of men, alarmed Sheriff Peppin. When the Regulators and McSween arrived, Sheriff Peppin only had around 15 men at his immediate disposal. The rest of his enormous posse had taken the field yet again to hunt down McSween and the Regulators throughout the mountains and various hot terrain of Lincoln County. McSween immediately took advantage of his superiority in numbers, and he set up his army around the town in various allied places. 12 of the men stayed at McSween's home. Some of those included Billy the Kid, the healed-up Jim French, the new recruit Tom Folliard, and the man from Roswell, Joe Smith. A handful of New Mexican Hispanics also shared the large space with the Regulators, McSween, his wife, McSween's sister-in-law, her children, and a man from New York, who unfortunately came to Lincoln to study law under McSween at the wrong time. This man's name was Harvey Morris. The 12 Regulators most likely slept on the roof and hoped it wouldn't monsoon on them. McSween's brother-in-law, he was out of town, and so was Weidman. Weidman was in Mesilla at court. Over at the Tunstall store, George Coe, Henry Brown, and another regulator stayed with the Reverend Dealey and his family, and his family's secretary. They had all moved into Tunstall's old room after his passing, or murder. At the Ellis store on the east end of town, another 12 regulators stayed there, including Charlie Beaudry, Doc Scurlock, John Middleton, Steve Stevens, and probably Fred Waite. Ellis, the store owner, and his wife and 2 adult sons were also there. A family called the Montaños, they owned a store on the far southeastern end of Lincoln in its one street. The house had an orchard and plenty of land. About 20 of the New Mexicans stayed there. Jose Montaño himself was in Santa Fe procuring more goods for his store. Also in town was a man named Saturnino Baca, his wife, and their 9 children. Saturnino Baca had actually fought with Kit Carson and the New Mexico Volunteers during the Civil War. He'd fought at Valverde against the Rebs before he and Kit Carson hunted down the Navajo throughout the Four Corners area. After his service, he became a county representative for Socorro. During his time there, he helped create the enormous county of Lincoln. The other members of the county commissioners actually wanted to name this new county that he had just created after Baca, so Baca County. But he refused the honor and instead suggested the name of the recently assassinated president for whom he'd fought for, President Lincoln. So that's how the county and the city came to be called Lincoln, where there was now a new civil war brewing, or already occurring. Baca and his family, though, they were renting a home in town from McSween. This normally wouldn't be a problem, except Baca was a full-on Murphy Dolan Riley House supporter. Now that the war was about to fully kick off, McSween sent him a rather straightforward letter that pretty much said, "You have to abandon the house I'm renting you immediately or face the consequences." He wrote, quote, "You have consented to improper use of the property by murderers for the purpose of taking my life, and I can no longer consent to your occupancy thereof." End quote. By improper use, McSween was hinting at the fact that the men in the Torreon, the stone Indian tower, they were being fed and armed by Baca and his family. The sheriff's men were constantly going back and forth from the tower to the Baca residency, which McSween owned. So to help even the odds and get the men out of the tower and away from their very good position, McSween was trying to force Baca out of the house. Baca, scared for his family's safety, he sent word to the commander at Fort Stanton, Dudley, and asked for some soldiers to protect his family from McSween. Now, because of the recently passed Posse Comitatus Act, Dudley could do no such thing. Yet. So instead, he sent the fort's surgeon, the lying surgeon who switched the story of Tunstall's death after some pressure by the house. But Dudley sent Lieutenant Appel to McSween to see if he could reason with the man. McSween held firm, though. He said, if Baca and his family, who are harboring and helping men who want to kill me, if he and his family don't leave, I will burn them out. With that, Baca sent his family to Fort Stanton. But he himself, Baca, would stay in town. Or rather, he would return to town after escorting his family. He was in this fight for the house. Obviously, as that story highlights, Peppin's men, the ones that were in town, they did find themselves some defensive positions, as many as they could, the Torreon being the main one for now. But Appel, who was sent by Dudley, he spoke with McSween, and that's when McSween would give his fateful proclamation. He told Appel, and Appel recorded, that McSween had said that he had, quote, been out in the hills long enough, that as he had now returned to his house, they would not drive him away again alive. End quote. Author George R. Matthews, in his book Billy the Kid, The Life Behind the Legend, he has a really great paragraph about Peppin's men and what they saw when McSween entered the town. I'll just quote it and then explain the Torreon a bit again. Quote, 7 of Sheriff Peppin's men, John Long, Billy Matthews, Jim Reese, Sam Perry, Jim McDaniels, George Rose, and a man called the Dummy, who was thought to be deaf and dumb, had watched McSween's brigade ride into town from the stone Torreon that had originally been built to defend the town against Mescalero Apache raids. Peppin and another 6 or 7 men, including Pantaleon Gallegos, Lucero Montoya, and Andy Boyle, had happened to be at Sam Wortley's hotel and eatery at the time. End quote. When my wife, our 6-week-old son at the time, and I went to Lincoln in June of 2025, I did not know what to expect. I had been there before, a long time ago, in 2012, but it was foggy, snowing, windy, and cold. So I didn't even get out of the truck, nor did I even realize the significance of the town at all. Obviously, this time 13 years later, I was fully aware of every name, building, and bluff around the small one-street town. Back in 2012, though, I distinctly remember the Torreon. I even took a bad iPhone whatever at the time picture of it. I think it was my first iPhone. I had assumed at the time it was some sort of Puebloan structure, some sort of engine structure. Instead, it's more like a Navajo Pueblito, which are defensive Navajo structures built like an Anasazi or ancestral Puebloan tower. The Torreon in Lincoln also looks like an Anasazi tower, some of the ones that dot the 4 corners, but it was built by the New Mexican Hispanics, specifically, as Matthews pointed out, to defend themselves against the Mescalero Apaches in the 1850s. But, and I confirm this the second time I went to Lincoln for Lincoln Days in August, the Torreon was built from stones from a Anasazi, essentially, ancestral Puebloan Pueblo. So there had been ruins there. The New Mexicans built the Torreon using those, smooth, you can just imagine any Pueblo ruin. They built the Torreon from Puebloan ruins. And recently, they found a skull. An ancestral Puebloan Anasazi skull. So, it was already before it was Lincoln, it was a site. It was 1,000 years ago, maybe 800 years ago for us. It was already a Pueblo. But all right, back to the story. I can imagine from atop this small stone tower fort, Peppin's men were dabbing their brow and contemplating changing their underpants as McSween's men occupied the entire town. Peppin himself sent immediate word to his men who were out hunting the Regulators. They were to the south, in the beautiful Ruidoso Valley, so they weren't too far away. The entire posse would arrive to the outskirts of town by nightfall of the same day that McSween and the Regulators had taken up their positions. Outside of town, between Fort Stanton and Lincoln, the posse ran into Appel, who was returning to the fort. At this point, Appel told the leaders of the posse, Buck Powell and boss rustler Kenny, Appel told them, look, you probably shouldn't go in there. They've taken up heavily fortified positions and they're ready for a fight. That was all the posse needed to hear. According to the Reverend Dealey's later writings, the posse excitedly, quote, rushed on at full gallop, end quote. As the men entered the town, shots rang out from the Regulators' guns, about 20 guns in all. But the posse made it to Wortley's hotel without any casualties. Night soon fell on Lincoln. The next morning, Monday, July 15th, Ely the Reverend opened the windows and doors at Tunstall's store and began to prepare for the day's school to begin for the town's children. He had not only started a church, but also a school. He was trying to civilize the region, after all. But one of McSween's nephews came to Ely and told him, quote, "There will be no school today as both parties are in town." End quote. The showdown would soon begin. Later that day, only 12 families of the normally upwards of 40 families remained in Lincoln. Everyone else had skedaddled in anticipation of the coming fight. At McSween's fortified adobe home, the Regulators with William Bonney the Kid were hard at work. They were knocking holes in the wall, bricking up windows, barricading doors, and preparing for a long siege. All throughout the day, gunfire was exchanged between the two sides. Bullets went back and forth across the street with neither party doing any real damage. Although there was a Regulator man that would die on Tuesday. There is no record of if he died by lead poisoning or some other nonviolent sickness. Minister Ely would do all he could for the man, but there was nothing to be done. And then Ely did not write about what killed this Daniel Huff. Before sundown on Monday, the second day, Dolan and a few of his men would also arrive, and when they did, they let loose 100 bullets. Maybe the man that would die, Huff, took one of those. In the dark of night, Sheriff Peppin and Dolan would surround McSween's home by keeping their men in the Torreon and by placing men in the Chavez house and the Mills house. The Mills house belonged to the ex-sheriff Ham Mills, but by now the house was empty. Ham Mills had gone out for some cigarettes and milk and had never returned. His wife and child were forced to move on. Like nearly everyone in this story, and I'm not being dramatic, but almost everyone, Mills would be shot dead. He would die in Silver City a few years later. So by Tuesday morning, the McSween's house, as fortified as it was, had become surrounded by Dolan and the sheriff's men. But that still hadn't turned the tide. McSween's walls were too thick. The home was too heavily guarded. The flat roof had a perfect lay of the town. A whole day of firing had proven ineffective for the house. So to remedy this, Dolan came up with a foolproof plan. "I will blast them out with a cannon." To put this plan in motion, Dolan had Sheriff Peppin send a note to Dudley at Fort Stanton. The note read, quote, "If it is within your power to loan me one of your howitzers, I am of the opinion that parties for whom I have warrants would surrender without a shot being fired. Should it be in your power to do this in favor of the law, you would confer a great favor on the majority of the people of this county, who are being prosecuted by a lawless mob." End quote. A truly egregious twisting of the facts that I don't even need to explain. Dudley would write to the head of the military in New Mexico, General Hatch. He would write to him with frustration that he could not send the howitzer. He described the situation and made it out to be that the McSweens were defying the law and trying to start a war, which I guess is technically true. But there were a lot of inconceivable treachery and miscalculations that had led to this unfortunate scenario. Dudley then sent a rider to Lincoln to explain to Dolan and Peppin that he could not, in fact, lend a cannon. I will now quote Matthews on what happened to this trooper. It's an interesting, intense little story. It helps to show the disarray in and outside of Lincoln. Quote, "Tuesday evening, about 6:30, Private Barry Robinson, carrying a letter from Dudley denying Peppin's request, hurriedly saddled his horse at Fort Stanton. He made pretty fast to reach Lincoln before dark. A good distance outside of town, 4 men, painted like Indians, stopped the African-American cavalryman and asked his destination. Quote, 'To attend my business,' answered Robinson. Asked again, Robinson replied, "I'm on government business. I'm not a citizen." End quote. "You talk pretty damn saucy," one of the men said. "I talk no more damn saucy than you do," Robinson reported. The four men drew their revolvers and surrounded Robinson, who calmly raised his own revolver and, after a tense moment, rode on. Private Robinson later reported that when he reached the wheat field just at the western outskirts of Lincoln, the men at the McSween house shot at me through portholes on the top. One ball whistled past my horse's head. He got scared and fell. I got off, but held on to his bridle and remounted. Mr. Dolan motioned me to come on fast, and I ran the horse until the Hotel Wortley was between me and the party firing at me. When I walked for the hotel, the sun had not yet set, and I am sure they could see I was a soldier." End all quotes. So did McSween's men and the Regulators fire at this Buffalo soldier? Or did the men in the Torreon fire at him? And once he met with Dolan, Dolan promised him, "No, it was not my men in the Torreon. It must have been them scoundrels over at McSween's on the roof," despite the fact that they were being fired upon on the hillsides constantly. Because by Tuesday evening, even more of Dolan and Peppin's men had been sent to the hills south of town, where they were able to rain down fire upon the Montano store and McSween's home. So who fired at the Buffalo soldier? I doubt it could have been men on top of McSween's home who were being fired upon from the hills. Their positions may have been fortified, but the Regulators were stuck and besieged. Water would eventually become a problem. And this whole firing on the Buffalo soldier, well, clearly that will also come back to haunt whoever did it. Well, no, it'll only haunt the McSween Regulator faction, but... On Wednesday, Dudley, over at Fort Stanton, prepared a group of officers and troopers to head to town to investigate why someone had fired at his Buffalo soldier. Robinson, the soldier, claimed that the firing had come from McSween's. And you bet your bottom dollar that Dolan was going to make sure that story stuck. From Fort Stanton, the previous commander, Purrington, the surgeon, Lieutenant Appel, Captain Thomas Blair, and a few troopers began making their way to Lincoln. While they were en route, though, two of Dolan's men were coming down from the hill from which they'd been sniping at the Regulators, the same hill they climbed up on the previous day. One of them did not make it down the hill. Bullets from McSween's, the Montanos, and Ellis's home tore into one of the men, a certain Charlie Crawford. The other man escaped. The poor Charlie Crawford took a bullet that ricocheted off his rifle and entered near one side of his hip and went out the other side of his hip. He lay in the hot summer sun dying with no one daring to rescue or help him. Eventually, though, the firing stopped when Purrington, Blair, Appel, and their escort entered town. Apparently they rode from one side of town to the other, so from the west to the east, before going back west again. And on their way back west, they stopped at the Dolan house. Dolan and Sheriff Peppin confirmed Robinson's story that the firing had come from McSween's. Well, obviously they did. The men then rode to McSween's, who denied that the firing had in fact come from his house. Obviously they did that as well. After talking with McSween, though, the Army men were sure in their belief that the firing had indeed come from McSween's. And no, they never bothered to find out who were painted like Injuns outside of town and who surrounded Robinson with guns drawn. They never questioned the men in the Torreon either. I mean, they had to have known it was Boss Kinney's men who were dressed up like Indians. But that fact was not important. And interviewing the men in the Torreon, that was not important. It did not fit the narrative. After McSween's, Appel, Blair, and two troopers went to the dying Crawford, who'd been shot in the hip. They helped him up, and took him back to Fort Stanton, where he would die a week later. Interestingly, and very unsurprisingly, although the 3 other men with Appel never reported this, Appel himself said that the McSween faction in Montagno's store, they fired upon he and his men as they went to help Crawford. Nobody else reported that. It was only Appel who changed the death of Tunstall to being shot in the back of the head to in the forehead, and he had some sort of venereal disease that had thinned the skull bone. I don't even... Appel was a Dolan House partisan. The 4 men were never fired upon while helping Crawford. Appel made it up. Fiction. But the firing on Robinson, the Buffalo Soldier, the made-up firing upon Appel, these lies... Well, somebody fired at Robinson. But these lies would influence the coming disastrous end to the 5 Days War in Lincoln, also known as the Big Killing or Big Kill. Later that night, the Elys, who were boarded up at the Tunstall store, they too began to be fired upon. Mary Ely would later say of the evening, quote, "We barricaded our windows with our trunks and laid our beds on the floor," end quote. So they were just firing at completely innocent civilians, a minister and a surgeon and a teacher at that, and his wife and kids. At around the same time that the Tunstall store came under fire, over at the Ellis home towards the east end of town, one of Ellis's adult sons, Ben Ellis, was shot in the neck while outside tending to horses. Clearly, he needed the surgeon and Reverend Ely, and someone had to go get him, even though he was also being fired upon. Maybe it was planned. I will now let Matthews describe what happened next. Quote, 2 men from the Ellis house, perhaps Beaudry and Scurlock, waded up the Rio Bonito until they reached the bank in back of the Tunstall building. They crawled up the bank to the corral and across to the back door of the Ely residence while under heavy fire from the Torreon. Ely started to go with the 2 men to tend to Ben Ellis, but gunfire prevented him from doing so. End quote. The whole town was truly becoming a war zone. Not even the Reverend Doctor could attempt to cross the street to save a man's life. The following morning, Thursday, July the 18th, Ben Ellis was still alive and still suffering from the gunshot wound to the neck. And we have recently seen what a gunshot wound to the neck can do, so it's a miracle that he survived. Ely knew he had to do something. But going outside was suicide, even for the town's minister and surgeon. He had to do something, though, so he took an enormous gamble, one I'm not even sure I would take. He reckoned there's no way the men on the Torreon or the men in the Dolan buildings would fire on a man holding his infant in one arm and the hand of his 2-year-old in the other arm, with his wife in tow. So that is what he did. He wrapped his child and took his daughter Pearl by the hand, and the family walked from Tunstall store all the way down to the Ellis house. No bullets shattered the morning air. Ely dressed Ben Ellis's wounds before heading back down the street safely to the Tunstall store once again with his family in tow. At around this same time of Ely's daring move that saved a man's life, over at Fort Stanton, Dudley was itching to do something, to do anything. He wrote General Hatch over in Santa Fe again and described the situation. Not the actual situation, mind you, but the situation he wanted to convey to the head of the military of New Mexico. He wrote, quote, "The latest reliable reports give McSween strength in Lincoln as 63 men, that of the sheriff's posse about 40. Both are thoroughly armed and well supplied with ammunition, and I think with 18 days' provisions at least. It is reported that Chisholm and some other leader of the party are en route to Lincoln with 35 men and a 6-pounder. I question the correctness of this report. Still, it may be true. If so, the sheriff's posse will have to vacate in a hurry. But whoever thinks this is going to end the war is most seriously mistaken. End quote. Chisholm was, in fact, not on his way, and he also did not have a 6-pounder cannon. Anyways, where would the man find a cannon? No, I really would like to know. But Chisholm wasn't on his way with a cannon, nor was he on his way with 35 men. He wasn't on his way at all. But truthfully, at this moment in time, the McSween-Lincoln faction and the Regulators didn't need any help. They had the advantage. For now. The man who joined up with McSween over in Roswell, Joseph Smith, not that one, but Joe Smith, he was already a partisan fighter. He was willing to die for the town and the men around him. When he had joined up only a few days earlier, he had essentially quit his job as a cowboy, which he had done so on the fly without telling his boss. But later, while holed up on Thursday the 18th, or possibly the following day, but he finally wrote a letter to his boss apologizing for quitting. He wrote, quote, "You must not think hard of a fellow for quitting you, but I wanted to go, so I went." End quote. In that same letter, though, he also described the situation in town, which is worth reading. He wrote, quote, "I thought I would write you a few lines to let you know what the people are doing up here. We have taken the town. One was killed, Crawford, and one wounded. Ben Ellis was shot through the neck. Everything is fair in war. I heard Jim Reese cried because he is on the other side. He says he is in it and can't get out of it. All of them have taken an oath to stand by each other until death. So I guess we will get to kill a lot of them before they get away. The U.S. troops have stepped aside and given us full swing. There is 45 of us citizens have turned out. I tell you, it makes a fellow's hair stand up when bullets coming whistling through the air. Then I get cooled down. I don't mind it much. Had a little excitement yesterday. The Murphys told some woman in town that they got a condemned cannon and was going to bombard the town. Tried to scare us out, but we didn't scare worth a damn." End quote. So both sides feared the other side would soon procure a cannon. But neither truly had one. Although that would change very soon. Cannons would indeed arrive in town because one man had finally had enough. That man was Dudley. On Thursday, Dolan had snuck out of town and had made his way over to Fort Stanton. He wanted an end to this, and he could see that his men were in the weaker position. Apparently, while Dolan was there at the fort, a local man who had no stake in the war, he overheard Dudley and Dolan talking. He would later say he heard Dudley tell Dolan that Dolan needed to go back to town and keep the McSween faction and the Regulators holed up, and that Dudley himself would be in town by noon the following day, Friday. Also that night, our old friend Juan Patron, who had been living at the fort since the Troubles, he was unceremoniously kicked out of the fort for being a spy for McSween. Now, to be fair, he was a spy for McSween, but he was also the Speaker of the House of the Territorial Representatives. That did not matter to Dudley, though. When Patron argued that he wasn't a spy and that he had the right to stay at the fort, Dudley apparently, quote, threatened to send him to McSween's house in a wagon, end quote, as in lying in the back of a wagon dead. With no other options, Patron would sneak his way to Las Vegas. There was one more happening at the fort that is very interesting, and it's interesting for a couple of reasons. There was a photographer at the fort named Tomlinson, and he apparently overheard some of the Seven Rivers boys complain to their boss Rustler Kinney. They were complaining that they were bored, and they wanted to commence with some violence. It's strange that Kinney was at the fort, but I reckon things had changed by now, and Dudley probably didn't mind the man there. Well, Tomlinson would later describe the conversation. He said that this man told Kinney that the men down in Lincoln, quote, were getting tired of the Lincoln County fight, and that he and others had come for the purpose of making a raise to pillage, and there was no use of waiting any longer, as they could do nothing without the assistance of the military. Kinney's reply was to wait a day or two longer, that he was assured that assistance would be had. End quote. The cannons were coming soon enough. And that fact was decided on Thursday evening at the fort. Matthews writes of this decision, quote, "Later that evening, Dudley held an informal council in his quarters. Present were Captains Purrington and Blair, Lieutenants Goodwin and Pegg, and joining them midway through the half-hour meeting, Lieutenant Appel. Dudley asked their opinion on sending troops to Lincoln. They all agreed to sign a resolution, quote, to place soldiers in the town of Lincoln for the preservation of the lives of the women and children." End quote. Only 2 days before, Dudley had refused Sheriff Peppin's request for a cannon, regretting that the Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibited military involvement in civil affairs, required him to do so. On Thursday, Jimmy Dolan somehow convinced Dudley to violate federal law and send troops to Lincoln. End all quotes. Word of this meeting spread around the fort, and eventually the officers were drinking and playing pool in their lounge, talking and gathering courage for the following day's events. And all of this was overheard by someone Ely would call an angel of mercy in a letter. And that angel would leave the fort that night, walk to Lincoln, and personally tell McSween of the coming firepower. Friday, July 19th, marked the 5th day of the 5-Day War. McSween, having heard word of what was coming, wrote a letter to Ash Upson down in Roswell, the man who will later write Billy the Kid's killer's biography. But McSween wrote Ash Upson and said in a solemn tone, quote, "Dear Ash, please send me $3 in stamps. I am here okay. I suppose you hear queer versions. Right will triumph." End quote. If only, brother. By 8 a.m. that morning, Dudley Do-Right, Purrington, who had Dudley's job not long prior, Blair, Goodwin, and Appel, along with 35 men, began their march towards Lincoln from Fort Stanton, which lay below them some 9 miles to the northeast. Accompanying them was a 12-pound brass Howitzer cannon, and, even more horrifying, a Gatling gun with 2,000 rounds of ammunition. Every one of those officers, by the way, were or had become partisans of the Murphy, Dole, and Riley faction of the House. McSween and the Regulators no longer stood a chance. By 10 a.m., the Army was on the western outskirts of Lincoln. Leading the column of the 35 men who had been placed into formation was Purrington. And at the signal, he began his march through town. Of course, Dolan and Peppin took advantage of this opportunity and used the soldiers as shields while they strategically fanned their men around the town and especially surrounding McSween's home. The Army made no motion to stop the encirclement. Some of Dolan's men took over the house across from McSween's, the Stanley home. Some of the posse ran around the Tunstall store and occupied the corral. The Mills house and the small home behind it, west of McSween's, were occupied by Dolan's men. Sheriff Peppin took up the Torreon and reinforced it. And it wasn't like the McSween men or the Regulators could do anything about it. If they fired at the posse that were intent on killing them, the Regulators' firing would be mistaken for firing on the soldiers, and the soldiers would open up the cannon and the Gatling gun. All the Regulators could do was watch as their end was being written, right there in the dirt of Lincoln. Purrington took the soldiers east of McSween's all the way to directly in front of the Montano store. They set up shop on the north side of the road, but kept a line of soldiers extending all the way to the Pitt House jail near the Dolan's house on the west end of town. McSween, the Regulators, and their New Mexican Hispanic comrades could do nothing about it, lest they encouraged hellfire from the U.S. Army, which in this instance was led by corrupt partisan men in favor of the house in the Santa Fe ring. The whole purpose of the Army being there was to guarantee the safety of the women and children. That was Dudley's stated reason. But the Army made no effort to find any women and children, let alone protect them. Dudley, as you're about to hear, will even point his armaments towards houses filled with women and children. He will then allow a fire to engulf the lives of even more women and children. And at no point will he attempt to quote-unquote rescue them. The Army was only there to make sure the McSween faction and the Regulators came to an end. After setting up camp, Dudley's first order was to ready the cannon and point it directly at the Montano store. Obviously, those inside the store, mostly New Mexican Hispanics, suddenly remembered that they did not want to get blown to bits, so they covered their heads with blankets and abandoned the building. Many of them ran further east to the Ellis home, where they joined Charlie Beaudry and Doc Scurlock. So one strong position was now vacated. The reality of the situation, though, it truly hit the McSween faction after Susan McSween saw 3 soldiers leave the camp to their east and head west towards the Wortley Hotel. The Wortley Hotel was where most of the Dolan men were hiding out. Susan McSween bravely ran out to the soldiers in the street and asked them what they were doing and why they were in town. The soldiers gave no reply, so Susan ran back to her home. But shortly after that, well, here's what Susan later recalled. Quote, "After a few minutes, I saw the same 3 soldiers going back to camp with Mr. Peppin. Well, after this, we all became alarmed, all who were in the house seeing Peppin guarded by the soldiers." End quote. Dudley then placed soldiers directly in front of McSween's home. They stood in front of the windows and the doors. Again, it was an attempt to stop the Regulators from firing on the Dolan faction. Alarmed, McSween wrote a note to Dudley, after having everyone in the home, including Billy the Kid and the constable of San Patricio, Jose Chavez y Chavez, read the note as well. The note stated, quote, "Would you have the kindness to let me know why soldiers surround my house? Before blowing up my property, I would like to know the reason. The constable is here and has warrants for the arrest of Sheriff Peppin and his posse for murder and larceny." End quote. I like the tone of the note, but it is rather sad. A cannon, a Gatling gun, 35 soldiers, and the posse of Dolan and Peppin had his home and his family and his friends completely surrounded, and it appears that they had the intent of letting no one escape alive. Dudley's reply, though, was pretty horrendous. He gave the note to Goodwin and told him to deliver it to McSween. It read, quote, "A. McSween, Sir, I am directed by the commanding officer to inform you that no troops have surrounded your house, and that he desires to hold no correspondence with you. He directed me to say that if you desire to blow up your house, he has no objection, providing you do not injure any of his command by so doing." End quote. It was a blatant lie and a twisting of McSween's own words. There is rumor of another note that was written by McSween to Dudley, and in that note McSween tells Dudley that he will surrender, but only to him. Apparently Dudley's response was something to the effect of, "I don't have the authority. I'm just here to protect the women and the children." Clearly, the atmosphere in Lincoln was growing more and more tense by the minute. As the story I'm about to tell you indicates, that morning Dudley had gone to a justice of the peace, possibly Wilson, and had forced him to sign warrants for McSween's arrest. Dudley told Peppin to deliver the message, but Sheriff Peppin gave it to Marion Turner instead. I'll quote Author Matthews for this anecdote. There is harsh language, so be warned. Quote, "Marion Turner later claimed that on that morning he and a few Seven Rivers boys went to the McSween house and, using the butts of their rifles, shattered some windows and knocked down the adobe bricks that had been piled on the deep window sills. Turner shouted that he wanted to talk to McSween. 'What do you want?' called McSween. 'I have warrants for you and the others in the house,' Turner answered. 'Will you surrender?' 'We have warrants for you,' McSween countered. 'Show me your warrants,' Turner demanded. 'Where are they?' Before McSween could reply, Jim French shouted, 'They're in our guns, you cock-sucking sons of bitches!' Turner and his boys quickly retreated to their positions under cover. End all quotes. Dudley did nothing about this little encounter, and after having witnessed the effectiveness at pointing a cannon at a building filled with people, he ordered his men to now move the Howitzer down the street and point it toward the Ellis home, which is where the men had fled to from the Montano store. Inside the home were about 40 New Mexicans and a few regulators, including Middleton, Waite, Stevens, Beaudry, and Doc Scurlock. I imagine the Ellis family was also inside as well, but I'm not sure. After aiming the cannon, Dudley then summoned Peppin to his tent. Once the sheriff had arrived, Dudley told the sheriff to go and arrest everyone in the Ellis home. Peppin took the order and gathered a few of his men. 6 or 7 men then walked east towards the Ellis home, but by the time they reached it, they noticed all 40 of the occupants, including the regulators, were already on their horses and preparing to ride east out of town. The Ellis home was essentially at the easternmost edge of Lincoln. As soon as the lawmen saw the 40 armed riders, they prepared to open fire. The regulators and New Mexicans fired first, though, and in their escape, they injured a posseman named John Jones, not fatally. McSween probably understood why they had fled, but he no doubt lamented the loss of 2/3 of his men and defenders. His situation was not improving, and it was about to get a lot worse. Seeing the writing on the wall and wanting to end this once and for all, Peppin gathered his men and told them it was time to finish this. He commanded his posse members to set fire to McSween's home. He was going to burn them out or burn them up. Either way was fine with him. I'll let Matthews yet again describe how Peppin wanted to accomplish burning down McSween's adobe home. Quote, "But adobe houses do not burn easily. Peppin told Kinney and Hurley to pile some wood against the McSween home. Bob Beckwith filled a bucket with coal oil at the Ellis house to pour over the wood and start the fire. Kinney and Hurley corralled 2 of McSween's hired men, Sebrian Bates and Joe Dixon. From inside the house, Susan McSween spotted Bates and Dixon piling lumber against the east wing. Kinney and Hurley stood watch with their guns pointed at the 2 McSween employees. 'What are you doing?' she shouted. Bates answered, 'These 2 men are trying to force us to carry the lumber to the house.' Whereupon Kinney and Hurley decided it best to leave." End all quotes. So the first attempt did not work out. But Matthews continues the story, and I will let him tell it as opposed to me retelling it myself, because it's got a lot of quotes, and it's just easier this way. Incensed, Susan was determined to go to Dudley and insist he forbid Peppin's men from setting her house afire. She crawled out of the house on her hands and knees to avoid possible stray bullets. Once in the street, she stood up and marched to Dudley's camp. The lieutenant colonel was not there, but Sheriff Peppin was. Susan demanded that her house be spared. Peppin told her that, "If I did not want my house burned down, I must make those men who were in the house get out of it," and vowed to take them, quote, "today, dead or alive," end quote. Susan declared that she intended to ask Dudley for protection. The sheriff replied that she need not, quote, "think that she could get any protection from Colonel Dudley or anyone else," end quote. Sheriff Peppin was right. When Dudley returned to his camp, he initially ignored Miss McSween, then dismissed her with a shrug. The determined woman refused to leave until he addressed her demand. Finally, Dudley told Susan that the burning of her house was none of his business, and as long as, quote, "such men as Billy Kidd, Jim French, and others of like character occupied her home, he would allow Peppin's men to do as they pleased," end quote. When Dudley named Billy Kidd, he may have been the first to link the name Billy with Kidd. End all quotes. So there you have it. These corrupt military leaders were going to allow these corrupt lawmen to burn her house down. Corrupt lawmen who were placed into power illegally by the corrupt governor, who was controlled by the corrupt Santa Fe ring, which themselves were in cahoots with the corrupt Dolan House faction. The army was going to let Peppin and his men burn McSween's house down with everyone in it. If Billy the Kid really had chosen the name the Regulators, he could not have picked a better moniker. Regulators strike blows in defense of justice. Unfortunately, there would be no justice for the Regulators or Lincoln County in this episode or the next few. Obviously, Susan McSween pointed this injustice out to Dudley. Dudley claimed she and her husband were harboring criminal fugitives. But that was really no longer true, unless you count these kangaroo court warrants that were issued at the barrel of a gun that very day, or at least yesterday. The Regulators and McSween had been exonerated in April in court. And as a matter of fact, there were actually warrants out for the arrest of a slew of Peppin's men for the murder of John Tunstall, a murder which had yet to be given justice, unless you count the frontier justice of killing Sheriff Brady in the street and the 2 men on the road. Susan McSween also pointed out to Dudley that, quote, "Those arrest warrants are nothing more than death warrants with the judge's signature," end quote. She meant the fake arrest warrants against her husband and the Regulators that had been issued at the barrel of a gun that morning. Well, actually, there was one man in McSween's house, the only man who had actually bothered to show up to sentencing, and he did have an arrest warrant out on him that was legitimate. Here's another quote from Matthews. Susan McSween mainly spoke the truth. The 12 Lincoln County citizens inside her house, including Joe Smith, Francisco Zamora, Vicente Romero, and newcomer Tom Folliard, had not committed any crime, and Jim French, one of those who had killed Sheriff Brady, had escaped being indicted. But there was one person inside the McSween home who had committed a crime and had been indicted. Billy Bonney. End quote. It's unfortunate and unfair that the previous and the coming events have all been put on the shoulders of Billy the Kid. I have become far more sympathetic to he and the Regulators after reading Matthew's exceptional book. Now, of course, that sympathy won't last forever because he does turn bad, but if you've been listening to the series, he didn't have much of a choice. We all have choices, of course. His were just difficult. There was really no way out of this predicament for McSween or the men and women in his home. But the Regulators and the New Mexican Hispanics who had ridden to his aid weren't out of the fight completely. Sometime after Susan McSween had spoken with Dudley and then returned home, gunfire erupted from the hillside north of town behind McSween's home. The 40 who had rode off had snuck themselves around Lincoln and had taken up positions, and they were now shooting at Peppin's men. Dudley, though, calmly ordered the cannon to be pointed towards the hillside. This time, he gave the order to prepare to fire. Seeing this, the Regulators and their neighbors again fled their position and rode away to stay alive. With the heat of bullets on their backs, Peppin ordered 3 of his men to sneak around the back of the McSween residence to light it on fire yet again. The 3 men, John Long, Buck Powell, and Dummy, they made their way to the back wall and then crawled to the back of the house. They made it to the wooden kitchen door, where they threw coal oil on it and lit it on fire. As soon as the flames began licking the door, George Coe, Henry Brown, and Sam Smith, who were in Tunstall's store, about 30 paces away, they opened fire on the 3 members of the posse. Long, Powell, and Dummy had no choice but to run as fast as they could back in the direction they came from. But the firing was intense, and they were forced into the only structure of significance in the area, the McSween's outhouse. But the outhouse was not necessarily the sturdiest of buildings, and it was getting completely, quote-unquote, shot full of holes. So the men did the only thing they could do to stay alive. They crawled down into the pit of the outhouse. Long would later say of the hiding spot, quote, "It was not a good place to sit down," end quote. And that's putting it mildly, but they deserve it. They were stuck in the hot and stinking pit hole full of human excrement until nightfall. Over at McSween's, Susan's sister and McSween's sister-in-law and the wife to his business partner, Elizabeth Shield, immediately extinguished the flames. But before long, another of Peppin's men, this one Andy Bull, successfully crawled across the lawn out of range of fire from any of the Regulators, and he successfully lit the only wooden structure on the property on fire. This structure is known as the summer kitchen. The flames spread rapidly in the summer winds that roared through the canyon on their way eastward out of the mountains. Of course, when the men of the house ran to put out the flames, they came under heavy fire from Peppin's men, who were stationed in McSween's own stable. Dudley did not turn his cannon towards the men firing at McSween. McSween's men were unsuccessful in putting out the flames this time, which by now had spread to the roof beams of the adobe house. Just about the only wood in the building, really. I have beautiful, heavy, and old wooden beams on the ceiling of our bedroom and our living room. I could not imagine watching them burn and watching that fire spread from beam to beam above me and my family. And knowing that if we ran, we would be shot down. I'll let Matthews describe what happened next. Quote, "The men, women, and children inside dragged furniture, rugs, mattresses, and anything else that might catch fire, including Susan McSween's organ, from room to room ahead of the advancing flames, all to no avail." In the Saga of Billy the Kid, published in 1925, author Walter Noble Burns created the myth that while the house burned, Susan McSween, quote, "threw herself upon the stool at the keyboard and plugged into the stirring bars of the Star-Spangled Banner. The kid whistled the tune. Tom O'Filliard beat time with a six-shooter," end quote. In an interview in 1927, Susan McSween exploded the myth. "God forbid," she said, quote, "that I could ever be so void of sentiment to sit down and play on it under such grave moments," end quote. The flames crept relentlessly ahead, first licking, then consuming the wooden window and door frames, the ceiling vigas and latillas, then the furnishings inside the house. As the occupants retreated from room to room, the heat and smoke became almost unbearable. The dirt-covered ceilings of each room began to collapse, sending clouds of dust into the room ahead. The smoke and dust made eyes water and choked the throats of those inside. All the while, Peppin's men, quote, "continued to shoot into every door and window." End all quotes. Not only were the flames and smoke encroaching, but the constant gunfire from the Dolan faction kept the people in the house down and low. Dudley made no attempt to stop the posse from firing at the women and the children within the home. Later, Susan McSween would write a letter to John Tunstall's father, who was no doubt waiting in anticipation of every letter he received from the Minnie and Lincoln who wrote him. But Susan McSween wrote of that day and of the fire and of the firing. She would finish the letter with, quote, "Bullets were flying all around me that day. I feared nothing." End quote. All of this would be a horrifying scenario to live through. It would also be a horrifying scenario to witness, which is exactly what the Elys in the Tunstall store were doing. They were watching their friends and their home burn down, a home they once stayed in. They were in town on account of McSween after all. And they were now watching he and his family and his friends face impending horrible death. A slow and horrible death. Ely's secretary, Susan Gates, she could not take it anymore. Risking life and limb, she ran out of the Tunstall store amongst the firing and handed a note that Ely had written to Dudley. The note read, quote, "Please give us a guard of soldiers from this building. We have no place to go. We ask your protection." End quote. Dudley, finally doing what he claimed he was there to do all along, agreed that the women and children should be spared from the end of this war. While the McSween house burned, Dudley ordered some soldiers with a wagon to escort the Elys and his secretary out of town. Note that he didn't bother with the women and children inside of McSween's home. But when the wagon and soldiers began to travel down the road to the Tunstall store, the firing from both sides stopped. Seeing this was her only chance, Susan McSween ran out of her burning home and asked Blair, who was leading the wagon, if she and her sister's children could join the wagon. Blair agreed. It was almost dark when the wagon took the families and women to safety at Juan Patron's home. Susan McSween would never see her husband alive again. On account of Matthew's exceptional research and writing, a much more accurate story is told about the end of the Big Killing or the 5 Days War. The other books truly just repeat the myths and untrue, although exciting, events as fact. I do not for a second believe Billy the Kid called Gonzalez a damn greaser after he wimped out. I don't believe Billy the Kid was quote-unquote jumping around the room like a caged cat, as Gardner describes. Mr. McSween hadn't quote-unquote lost all reason and had given up until Billy shook him awake and made him stand. Billy the Kid didn't run out of the house and alert the soldiers or the sheriff's men while firing at them. McSween didn't ask for surrender and then suddenly declare, "Never mind, I will never surrender," before being shot. The escape into the night from the burning home was much less thrilling, although still incredibly tragic. A year later in court, William Bonney the Kid would note how bright the fire from McSween's home had made Lincoln after the sun set. McSween's burning house made it, quote, almost light as a day for a short distance all around, end quote. That bright fire also made it hard to escape the engulfing flames on account of the escaping men being seen from the soldiers and the posse, and then being fired upon. But as night fell, slowly, when bullets weren't being shot into every space not burning, the men holed up in the house began to escape. The first two to escape were Florencio Chavez and Jose Maria Sanchez. They snuck out without being noticed by the army or Sheriff Peppin's men. The man whom they'd picked up in Roswell, Joe Smith, he and Tom Collins and George Bowers also escaped without being detected. Eventually, Billy the Kid and Jose Chavez also dared to sneak out of the property, but they were noticed. Jose Chavez would later say of his escape, quote, "I came out slowly, terribly slowly, because they were not firing at the time. I went slowly until I saw the soldiers fire. Then I went with all my might. There was no firing when I came out until I got to the point in the middle between the two houses." End quote. Both William Bonney the Kid and Jose Chavez would later say the soldiers fired upon them. For what purpose? I am not sure. But I am sure that Billy the Kid did not burst out of the house guns blazing. There is, in 2025, a mural at the Lincoln Town Living History Museum, which is the whole town pretty much, but there is still a mural there that shows Billy the Kid shooting guns as he runs out. That is not how it happened. Right behind the Kid and Chavez were French, Tom Folliard, who had also just joined them, and Ignacio Gonzalez. They were fired upon the entire time they made their escape, since they had been alerted by Billy the Kid and Chavez. Gonzalez actually got hit in the arm while he fled. But they all ran across the Rio Bonito and up the hills and into the wilderness. It may be true that these men were trying to escape one way so that McSween could escape another. But it seems unreasonable that McSween would choose to sneak out at the most difficult and highly guarded spot. A spot that was surrounded, and had been surrounded all day, by Peppin's men. But that is what happened. So for the remaining men in the house, including McSween, I will just quote Matthews. While Bonney and his group ran for their lives, McSween, Francisco Zamora, Vicente Romero, 15-year-old Yinio Salazar, and law student Harvey Morris crept slowly in the shadows cast by the rear house walls toward the gate in the back. Exactly what happened next will never be known. But the next morning, The bodies of McSween, Zamora, Romero, and Morris lay sprawled behind the still smoldering remains of the McSween home. Salazar had been thought dead the night before, but his body was not found. McSween had been shot 5 times. Zamora 8 times. Romero 3 times in his body and leg, and Morris once. Peppin's man, Robert Beckwith, lay among the others with 2 bullet wounds, one in the head and one in the wrist. All were slowly stiffening with rigor mortis. Bonney and those who had stealthily escaped through the east gate had not fired a shot. Beckwith was probably killed by friendly fire. End quote. McSween had been telling the truth. They were not going to drive him from his home again alive. As Maurice Fulton points out, and Matthews reiterates, what transpired behind McSween's house that got so many men killed may never be known. Fulton wrote, quote, "What caused this final outbreak of shooting is one of the insolubles of the Lincoln County War. As usual, there are several versions, in bewildering contradiction." End quote. Fulton actually describes and quotes every recorded version of events. He includes a letter from Susan McSween to Tunstall Sr., but that version actually seems the least likely. Every version has just something slightly off. But what does seem most likely is that McSween and his party attempted to sneak out of the house, but were ultimately sighted by Beckwith and a quote-unquote ruthless and reckless man named John Jones. Jones was either a Seven Rivers boy or a group of the boys, or just one of Boss Russ or Kenny's men, it doesn't matter. So McSween and his guys are spotted. They ask to surrender. Beckwith is in the process of accepting their surrender until this John Jones fellow raises his rifle and points it at the surrendering party. At this point, Beckwith may have turned around and attempted to grab the rifle, but Jones shoots. The bullet shatters Beckwith's wrist before finding its way in the man's head. At that point, all hell breaks loose, and everyone fires on McSween and his little group, which resulted in the murder of everyone except Salazar. Fulton ends his discussion of McSween's death pretty well when he wrote, quote, "Regarding the death of McSween, the same conclusion is to be made that Judge Angel was compelled to give about the death of Tunstall. Who shot McSween will never be known. But there is no doubt that Robert Beckwith, John Jones, Joe Nash, and Andy Boyle were inside the yard and doing the shooting towards the group in the corner." End quote. There's also some confusion on account of the fact that some say McSween was dragged over to the burning house to catch fire, while others say he died and then Beckwith fell atop him. A couple of accounts say that actually, that Beckwith fell on top of McSween, which would suggest McSween died first out of everybody. The story then goes later Beckwith's body was removed from atop McSween. There is no straight account of the murder of McSween and his young apprentice and the New Mexican Hispanics, which is probably why Matthews just didn't even bother with going into every single story like Fulton did. I don't know what to believe, except that McSween was murdered, the Army was complicit, justice was not done in Lincoln. Mark Lee Gardner, in To Hell on a Fast Horse, he tells the story as fact, from one perspective and one perspective only. First of all, he quotes McSween as saying, quote, "Boys, I have lost my reason," end quote. To which Billy the Kid shakes him and jumps around and lifts him and tells him, quote, Mac, now we must run for our lives," end quote. But again, from what I read by every survivor, they sneaked out. Most of them were alive and able to to sneak out, and McSween and his men were also trying to sneak out until they were spotted. Gardner also claimed that the law student Harvey Morris was in the group that ran out of the house with Billy the Kid. Again, Billy and Chavez didn't run out, but tried to sneak out very slowly. Gardner claims that as they ran, quote, Morris, the unfortunate health seeker, collapsed in front of the kid, but he was the only casualty in the first group, end quote. First of all, Morris was a law student studying under McSween. He may have had TB, I don't know, but I didn't read anywhere else that he was a health seeker. Also, he left with McSween later and died with them, not with Billy the Kid. Finally, and I keep picking on Gardner, but he remarks that when McSween became spotted, he shouted that he wished to surrender, only to say, quote, I will never surrender, end quote. A ridiculous thing to even imagine happening. But Gardner goes on to say, after McSween said that, his party shot at Beckwith and his men, killing Beckwith, who fell, and then McSween fell on top of Beckwith, instead of the other way around. So as you can see, no one knows what truly happened. But I certainly trust author George R. Matthews. And I tend to believe the overall confusion will never give us a real answer as to what happened. But does what happened really matter when the result will always be the same? I will say this, though. I don't think McSween would have lost his cool or shouted something silly. I think he would have played it level-headed right up until the end. As Fulton writes of him, quote, under the trials of the successive weeks, he had borne himself courageously and clung to scriptural idealism to the end, refusing to shoulder a rifle or strap a revolver about his waist. No contemporary record, however, shows that he became at the last totally disqualified and unmanned by panic and fear. End quote. And Fulton's book came out in the 60s. Gardner's book recently. You would think he would have read some other sources besides the dime novels that he used to make his book. Over at the Tunstall store, George Coe, Henry Brown, and Sam Smith decided they'd better get the heck out of there as well, lest they, quote, face the whole army, end quote. Coe, whom that quote is attributed to, said that eventually they, quote, crept cautiously down to the Ellis house in the hope of meeting some of our own party. To our disappointment, when we arrived there, the family was terrified for the other faction had threatened to kill anyone seen entering the Ellis house. End quote. It was a threat everyone in the home took seriously. Ben Ellis had already been shot through the neck. They wanted no more bloodshed. Isaac Ellis, the other son, said, quote, George, for God's sake, get out. They will kill us all if they find you here. End quote. Coe responded with, quote, well, folks, this is heaven in here compared to what I've been passing through, but it's all right. I'm hungry and hatless, but I'll go. End quote. Tunstall store clerk, Sam Corbett, desperate to see the men leave, took his own hat from his head and handed it to George before saying, quote, all right, George, here's a hat for you, but hurry or they'll get us sure as hell. End quote. Before they left, Isaac's wife, Nancy, gathered some food for their journey into the unknown. Once outside and away from the bright fire, the moonless night proved to be dark and dangerous. Coe said they had to get down on their hands and knees to find the small bridge that would take them over the Rio Bonito. Once across, the men slowly made their way through the hills to the north of town. They meandered through a dark canyon and then back up in the hills before they finally had some relief. Coe then remembers seeing a light in the distance. He said they, quote, glimpsed a light in the east which grew brighter and brighter. It was a glorious half moon, climbing over the mountain to light us on our way. End quote. Once up on the hills, about a half mile from town in McSween's burning home, they came upon a small flat plateau where they ate the food the Ellises had given them and promptly passed out. Surprisingly, Billy the Kid, Jim French, Tom Folliard, and San Patricio residents Ignacio Gonzalez and Jose Chavez They all slept in the same hills, not far from Coe and crew. But Billy and his group were without food. Also sleeping in the same hills, and also not far away, were Regulators John Middleton, Charlie Beaudry, Doc Scurlock, Fred Waite, and a few others. None of the men had ran into each other that night, but they would the following morning in nearby San Patricio. After the McSween faction and the Regulators had all fled the field, after the McSween residence was becoming nothing but smoldering ashes, and after the fight of the big killing had been won by the house, with the bodies of the dead still laying where they fell, Dolan, Sheriff Peppin, and their men celebrated. Maurice Fulton writes of the aftermath, quote, "When the Peppin men realized that the consummation they had so devoutly wished in the death of McSween had come, they gave themselves over to celebration during the remainder of the night. In all this hilarity the killed and wounded were forgotten. The sheriff's posse hurrahed, they danced, they sang. The soldiers came down from their camp, and if not actually participants, were at least spectators of the carnival, improvised against a background of smoke-begrimed house walls, which kept vigil over the dead. For rejoicing in their victory, the Peppin crowd immediately commenced possessing themselves of the spoils. They battered down the doors of Tunstall's store and looted its shelves and showcases. They helped themselves to groceries, clothing, blankets, guns, ammunition, or whatever else their fancy dictated. Some of greater shrewdness than the rest tore their way into the room used as the bank and carried off what money they found." End quote. I am not sure if that actually happened, but it would not be out of character. I believe it happened. Heck, if I was part of that posse, I would have wanted to celebrate as well. Then there's the words of Boss Kinney's men, who said they wanted to pillage the town, and they were tired of waiting. So I really don't doubt it occurred. Of course, after the carnage in the wee hours of the next morning, the sheriff called a coroner's jury, which decided unanimously that McSween and all the others had been shot while trying to resist arrest. Never mind that there was no arrest warrant for a single person in the house except Billy the Kid, unless you count the fake ones issued the previous morning. The jury also determined that Beckwith had been killed by McSween and crew while he was attempting to arrest them. McSween didn't carry a gun. He died unarmed and shot to pieces on his own property as it burned to the ground. And I have no doubt that Beckwith was killed either intentionally or unintentionally by the aforementioned John Jones. As for Salazar, who had been shot and was supposed to be counted among the dead, well, he survived. He had been shot twice, though, once in the back and once in the shoulder, but the bullet took a circuitous route through his body and failed to exit. He collapsed from his wounds on the spot. But at around midnight, the man woke up and determined that he was going to live. He then crawled 1,000 yards or so, over half a mile, to where his sister-in-law was staying. Once there, his sister-in-law sent for the traitorous Surgeon Appel to come fix the man, which he did. And then he seemed to have repented for his previous sins. The following morning, the same morning as the coroner's jury, Boss Rustler Kinney and a few of his men found the blood trail of the man they were sure they'd killed, and they followed the trail all the way to Salazar, his sister-in-law, and Dr. Appel. Kinney busted through the door intent on finishing the job, but Appel stopped him and told Kinney that he himself would make sure Kinney was hanged if he touched a hair on Salazar's head. Kinney, frustrated, made his way back to his posse. Sometime that same morning, every survivor of the big killing on the late McSween side had reunited in San Patricio at a local home where they all had breakfast. Well, not all of them. Weidman was still out of town in Mesilla. We'll hear from him soon, though. George Coe would ride to the reunion at San Patricio and say, quote, "The Kid and others came straggling in until all of our boys were at home once more." End quote. George Coe would also say of this time that the previous day had taken it out of the men. The fight, especially now that McSween had been murdered, the fight was done. He wrote, quote, "When the warfare was over, we returned to the Ruidoso Valley. The big fight was finished. We were still at large, but realized the time had come for us to drift." End quote. most all the Lincoln County residents who weren't regulators just went home. The New Mexican Hispanics realized they'd lost the fight and there weren't nothing left to fight for. So the residents of San Patricio stayed in their little town after the fight as well. The military leaders at Fort Stanton had won. The Santa Fe Ring had won. The House in Lincoln County had won. But our story is far from over. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, the track a killer lion, lost his fear of man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters showed the chase and fall. Now the lever-action rifle and horses changed the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage in Caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.